use this medium. People waiting around, try to wait till everybody get on. That's all good. That's not exactly who I am. So I just start off because that's the way I've always done church for 46 plus years, is to do things on time and get right to it. Well, precipitated by the gruesome death of George Floyd, America is standing at a crossroads. A crossroads is plural in form, but can be either plural or singular in construction. We'll use the singular construction. That is, we'll talk about crossroads, but as singular in its reality. A crossroads is a place of intersection of two or more roads. A crossroads is a crucial point, especially where a decision must be made. The crossroad we are standing at is how to deal with institutional or systemic racism, implicit or unconscious bias. The protests, peaceful protests that are going on, and the looting and rioting that has erupted because of the tragic death of another unarmed black man at the hands of the police. Something unique happened with the death of George Floyd. Perhaps the fact that the tragedy of this police officer, Derek Chauvin, having his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds being televised, awakened something in America and in the world. Perhaps the fact that more people were at home because of stay-at-home orders provided wider viewing for this injustice. Perhaps the recent shooting of other African Americans has produced a cumulative effect. Perhaps the unwise comments of our president has provoked also this visceral response. Perhaps many who are at home had and have more opportunity to get out and protest despite COVID-19. And perhaps a combination of all these realities and many more contributed to what we are seeing in America and around the world. We don't know what caused this worldwide outcry, but what we do know is that the response is unprecedented. We have stood at this crossroads many times before, and if anything is clear, it is clear that what we have done in the past did not seem to ultimately work. And what did work doesn't seem to be working this time. In a way, that should be expected. A crossroads requires one to stop and consider the various crossroads. And this means that there is a time when a person doesn't know which road to take. Consequently, even though there are many people suggesting many solutions, I don't believe anybody knows exactly what to do right now. And furthermore, we need to consider a new road out of this difficulty. That's not necessarily bad. It is part and parcel of necessary endings and new beginnings. Therefore, I feel it's important to provide biblical, prophetic context to these unprecedented events. First, I cannot remember in my 68 years of life when whites have come out in this way for this cause. They largely missed the civil rights movement, but they are intent on not missing this movement or this moment. At first, I was concerned with the rioting and the looting, and I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. But the protests have been overwhelmingly peaceful. Early on, the news media seemed to be preoccupied with the rioting and the looting, but that began to change after a couple of days. Consequently, I've changed my mind. It's a crossroads, and I've decided to take another road. I was ready to tentatively and respectfully suggest that perhaps, and I was going to say this with great hesitancy, that while mass public protests had certainly had an impact upon the situation, maybe it had reached its limit. In contrast, as the protests have continued in a predominantly peaceful manner, they are strategically calling attention to the injustice of systemic racism and unconscious bias. The history of nonviolent resistance, which includes the method of mass protest that was used by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement, reveals a powerful method of protest that was used effectively for a time. It seemed to run its course. And in some instances, it was even rejected, and that rejection may have ultimately been demonstrated in the assassination of Dr. King. Nevertheless, these are not the 1960s. We have neither the cultural context nor the historic remembrance of nonviolent resistance. Therefore, I thought our culture was unprepared to process mass public protests, seeing that most of the youth protesters had no allegiance to the principle of nonviolent resistance. But I'm willing to admit, after taking a look at it again, that I was wrong. Something has prepared not only America, but the world for this revolution of protest. Possibly the imperialistic policies of the first and second world governments. The first world being the Western world, the second world being the USSR or Soviet and all of those countries' response. The third world being everybody else. But the first and second world governments are imperialistic. Even though they may be opposite in their philosophy, they're both imperialistic. So, because of that, I was worried about what was going on. Furthermore, evidently, the older generation has called for peaceful protests, called for it enough for the sentiment to register in most of the younger protesters. Yet I remain concerned that the younger people who are attending these protests, who are actually driving these protests, are angry. And that anger is not always checked by nonviolent values. Because many of these protesters are angry and have no allegiance to nonviolence, I'm concerned that it only takes a spark to ignite the dry tinder of that anger. And once that anger is ignited, there are opportunists present who will take advantage of the chaos to riot and to loot. So please consider the fact that when rioting and looting take place, it generally takes place in black neighborhoods and often destroys commodities that black people need along with black businesses. It also seems certain that agitators are being sent to the protests or are voluntarily using these events as an opportunity to act violently and to detract from the legitimacy of the cause. This makes it seem like protesters are simply violent people who want to use the event as an opportunity to be destructive. In watching some of the interviews, I was concerned that some of the young people didn't seem to understand what the protest was all about or what they were attempting to achieve. But as the interviews continued, I was surprised that many of the young people did seem to understand the main impetus of the protest, and that is it was a statement against systemic racism, unconscious bias, and injustice. Simultaneously, city and other leaders are taking advantage of the events to prosecute systemic changes like barring the police from using chokehold, making violent practices criminal. And whether more changes will come into effect, only time will tell. It's not easy to work through the legal statutes that are on the books. But let me be clear. I wholeheartedly support restructuring of the police and policing. I wholeheartedly support taking some of the money that is used for policing and distributing it to other initiatives that have to do with mental health and things of that nature. I'm not in favor of defunding the police, of what that word means. Now, we're using the term defund, which really means redirect some of the funds. But to defund the police or disband the police, I'm not in favor of that. We would have anarchy. I'm understanding a little bit more, so I want you to understand how that term is being used. Someone must police this society. The question is not whether somebody's going to police it, but how it's going to be policed, and is it going to be done in a just manner? Ultimately, what we need is a heart change. We don't just need laws to be changed. We don't just need economic opportunity to be given to us and to other minorities. We need to be treated like people. We need to be humanized. And we will not be treated humanely until those who are inhumane become humane. That means a change in heart. But remember what King said. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important. I've been also picking up on some of the impact of Christianity. People have been asking me, so where do you see the church at in this? What do you This movement is not driven by the church. It's driven by young people on the ground who don't seem to have any allegiance to the church whatsoever. The church will get back in. We'll figure out what we need to do. But right now, that's not what's going on. But when you look at the church and you see that the church is beginning to respond, white brothers and sisters are asking the question of blacks and of the church, what can we do? How do we need to respond? One of the things that has not been generally talked about that I just want to raise tonight is that perhaps what you need to do is repent. That when we don't talk about racism or bias as sin, but John is clear about that in 1 John. If you don't love your brother or sister, then how can the love of God reside in you? And if you're not loving your brother or sister, then that's a sin, and you need to repent from that sin. But that's not something we talk about. But yet I'm going to raise the question because I think we ought to talk about it from a Christian perspective. Even though this is a watershed moment, many whites are joining the protests. Other whites are now beginning to push back. And the intractability of the system of racism and unconscious bias and the uncomfortability of the conversation is beginning to reveal itself again and again. This was recently seen in the comments of Drew Brees and the responses that he was and continues to receive. The New Orleans Saints quarterback, who has been a passionate supporter of the military, but also a person that has done a lot of work in his community, stressed that he had no issue with Kaepernick's desire to speak out against racial injustice. He just had an issue with the San Francisco 49ers quarterback method of protest. Brees said that the American flag is sacred. I disagree, and I'm quoting him now. I wholeheartedly disagree, he told ESPN. Not that he wants to speak out about a very important issue. No, he can speak out about that important issue, but there are plenty of other ways that you can do a peaceful protest, or that you can protest in a peaceful manner that doesn't involve being disrespectful to the American flag. End of quote. Well, as he began to get some of that pushback, Brees attempted to walk back his comments by providing a statement to ESPN's Mike Triplett. And he said, I quote, "I love and respect my teammates, and I stand right there with them in regards to fighting for racial equality and justice. I also stand with my grandfathers who risked their lives for this country and countless other military men and women who do it on a daily basis." I also saw another quote where he said, "I need to seek to listen more than to talk right now." Even the commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell, has stated that the league was wrong in handling the issue of player protests. Of course, it all began with Colin Kaepernick, whose name was not raised and no offer has been given to give him his job back. So this major disconnect has been going on since Colin Kaepernick. Let me see if I can add a little light or a little connection to this disconnection. We are dealing with what I preached about some time ago called the military entertainment complex. The military entertainment complex is a powerful cultural machine that generates stories, images, praise, sacrifice, devotion to a national cause that is choreographed with bodily movement, standing, taking off one's hat, putting one's hand over one's heart, etc., in contexts that are deeply emotional Consequently, the military, patriotism, and entertainment are hopelessly intertwined. The conflating of music, the flag, soldiers, aerial flyovers, etc., invest certain practices with a charged sense of transcendence that calls for our allegiance and our loyalty in a way that is meant to outdo other ultimate loyalties, whether those other loyalties are ethnic or religious or moral or whatever. James K.A. Smith, in his books Desiring the Kingdom, another book Imagining the Kingdom, and the third book You Are What You Love, shows how these practices constitute a liturgy, a public practice that is not only enculturating but often needs to be heeded unconsciously. When the announcer says, "Please stand for the national anthem," the liturgy is so powerful that few people will think about what is being narrated, and certainly they're not going to disobey the announcer. He said, "Please stand." Of course, the liturgy is changing, and the announcer is beginning to use these words: "Please stand to honor the armed forces." I want to make it clear today that honoring the country is not the same thing as honoring the military or the armed forces. Then they play "God Bless America," or the national anthem is played in conjunction with that announcement. Yet there are all kinds of views that are being intermingled in that particular liturgy, in that practice. For instance, the myth of nationalism, the belief that our country is superior to any other, which concerns the sanitized story of our nation. Cornel West said that America has a national amnesia. We don't remember any of the things that took place in terms of what we did to the Indians, what we did to slaves, what we did to Japanese and Chinese folks during World War II in terms of internment. We have a national amnesia. We don't remember what took place. We don't want to talk about those things. Consequently, America has a great deal of trouble acknowledging all that took place in the past with these things. But then you have the myth of materialism, the aggressive use of force for the interests of America. You have the myth of imperialism, the aggressive American territorialism, that where we go in and take territory from people and proclaim that as right. We have various views of democracy, and we have the myth of majority rule. If we think majority rule, then we need to look at the last election, where the majority vote differed from the electoral vote, and we saw what happened. Many of these views not only unconsciously approve racism, many of them are anti-Christian. Consequently, please consider the following. The flag represents our country. The protesters aren't kneeling on the flag. There is no literal flag underneath the protesters. Often there is a flag displayed at the beginning of a sports event that is conflated with the national anthem. That's not the same thing as kneeling on the flag. The military fights for our country, but protesters aren't kneeling on the military. There are various views represented not only in our country, but among those who are in the military. And so protesters are not kneeling on the military. The national anthem is a song that represents the patriotism of our country, and the protesters are picking that particular moment to protest. This may be particularly poignant since there are racist lyrics even in the national anthem. And there is a debate that has been had about that. Were they meant to be there? What were the actual meaning of those lyrics? And when did they get there? And those kind of things. Finally, the government seems to be set to meet all protests with force. On May 29, 2020, the president warned the residents of Minneapolis in a tweet that they better calm down. Quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," end of quote. This tweet, along with a seemingly more forceful treatment of protesters and now even reporters, suggests that the government no longer views nonviolent protests as a right, no longer welcomes nonviolent protests, and apparently sees all protesters as violent anarchists. The government no longer seems to honor our constitutional right to peaceful protest. And this is causing people to be hurt and some to be killed. And while I don't want to see anyone injured, I want to see anybody killed, while I decry even the small percentage of looting and rioting that is occurring, and while I decry the way that some in the media are trying to depict these protests as initiated and populated by violent anarchists, they seem to be having a positive effect. Yet, it will take time to change legislation. Yes, it will take time to remove economic barriers and other barriers. Yes, it will take something powerful for the world to start treating African Americans as valuable human beings. But this protest has raised issues as never before. And people are coming out in support as never before. As Christians, in keeping with the theology of the cross, we stand with those who are oppressed and who are suffering. We do so in a non-violent and Christian way. Yet, we must afflict the comfortable by speaking truth to power. And we must comfort the afflicted with compassion and with love. And in all of this, we seek to advance the kingdom of God. We don't know how this is going to ultimately end. That's why it's a crossroads. We're standing at the crossroads. We don't know how it's ultimately going to turn out. But we can say one thing. At least we are standing at the crossroads again. I believe it is time for us, particularly those of us who are part of the Beth-El Fellowship, to get together again, to see one another through Zoom. So we're going to attempt to set up another Zoom meeting, and I'm probably going to do it at this time next Thursday. So you'll probably be getting some notice on that, be getting an invitation, so you can be a part of that. One last thing I just want you to be aware of somebody has hacked my email and sending out some various emails. If it don't sound like me, it ain't me. I'm not asking anybody for any money or anything crazy. So if you think it's not me, all you got to do is get in touch with me, and we'll help you with that. But God will work it all out. The devil can't win. And ultimately, right now, as we stand at the crossroad, we are determining with this necessary ending how to begin and start a new beginning of how we, the church, are going to interact in all of these monumental events. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm asking you to send this around because I'm trying to help people get a better, more balanced, biblical perspective of the things that are taking place. Have a great evening. Thanks for tuning in.